Jokes about the audience or anything like that. Guess we'll look at the chat here.
It all becomes so serious.
Yeah. Well, maybe we'll just have an intimate chat amongst the four of us. We'll see. I'm sure
So
some folks would.
Yeah. So if in Zoom, there's a participants tab, but also an attendees tab. So
okay.
I only saw the panelist tab for a while there and had the same thought. But the attendee numbers are growing quickly.
Oh, okay.
And
okay.
Hello,
good.
everyone. If you're joining us, we're in double digits.
Terrific.
Success already. And if folks can hear me, yeah, we'll give it a minute or two and let folks roll in before we get underway. We'll give one more minute in case there are a couple of stragglers, and then we will get underway, everyone. Those who are here, I know you've probably heard this from prior sessions, but there's a chat function, a Q&A function. Certainly feel free to use those. And this also may have come up in past sessions. If you are sort of multitasking and maybe walking around with the session on your phone, if you could just remember to mute. I think I know I suspect many of us have been in a situation where we didn't realize we had not muted and we're making a whole lot of noise for the rest of the group. So if you're not kind of right at a screen, if you could remember to mute. All right, and why don't we get underway? Thanks everyone for being here. My name is Matt Kaufman. I'm a volunteer board member with the Connecticut Foundation on Open Government, the Connecticut's affiliate to the National Freedom of Information Coalition, and I'll be moderating today's panel on legislative transparency, the written and unwritten rules that conspire to keep the public in the dark. So I want to say thanks, welcome to everyone joining on Zoom or on Whova. I am thrilled you're all here. I want to give a special welcome to anyone joining from Illinois or Oklahoma or Nevada or Washington State, where the legislatures aren't considered public agencies under open meetings laws or otherwise explicitly exempt from those laws. Ditto for Wyoming, home to one of our panelists today. Welcome to anyone from Massachusetts, where the legislature is likewise statutorily excluded from the public records law, which, if I have that right, just kind of blows my mind. An extra big welcome to anyone from Indiana, where the state Supreme Court ruled years ago that while the state's open door laws appears to cover the legislature, the Supreme Court nevertheless declared itself powerless under a separation of powers argument to actually enforce the law if and when the legislature were to violate it. And lastly, I want to give one final special shout out to anyone who might be joining us from Hawaii, where not only is the legislature specifically exempt from the open meetings law, but, and this doesn't just apply to the legislature, this applies to all public agencies in the Aloha State. Among the documents that are exempt from disclosure are, quote, government records that by their nature must be confidential for the government to avoid the frustration of a legitimate government function. And I can only imagine the fights that has led to. And these, of course, are only the written rules that can serve as a barrier, but there are unwritten roadblocks as well. So I mentioned the situation of these states first to kind of show what a hodgepodge of laws and rules we have, you know, when we cross one state border to the next, and how, you know, assuring transparency and a fully informed citizenry, it really is kind of a challenge from coast to coast. But in contemplating those challenges, maybe we can find a better way. And to help us explore those challenges, perhaps come up with some ideas for reforms, we have three terrific panelists. If we were in a room gathered at a table, I could say, you know, on my right or on my left, and I'm not sure what the boxes look like in our detached scenario. So, you know, maybe panelists, you could kind of wave as I introduce you. I guess folks have names, you know, under their photos as well. But first, from the aforementioned Wyoming, we have Gail Simons. Gail is the founder of Civics 307, a nonpartisan blog that covers Wyoming's legislature, and also WY Vote, or maybe it's pronounced Y Vote, and if so, it's kind of a great pun, because in fact this site explains to people why it is so important to vote and sort of help them vote. This is a website with county by county information on public offices, political candidates, ballot initiatives, voting procedures, and the like. Last fall, Gail was among the signers of a letter critical of rules for a special legislative session that would diminish the public's ability to participate in the process and just kind of make it tougher to keep tabs on what the legislature was considering and you know, participate and lend their views on those issues. Next, we have Rob Schofield. Rob is director of NC Policy Watch, part of the North Carolina Justice Center. He is a prolific writer on public policy topics in North Carolina. Those are my words. And when a journalist describes someone as prolific, what they mean is, how in the world does this person write so much and so well? So I am kind of impressed and envious of Rob's ability to quickly put smart words to paper. So has written on public policy topics in his state and beyond, including some very pointed commentaries on secrecy in the North Carolina legislature and a string of broken promises on legislative transparency. All right, finally, from my home state, we have Colleen Murphy. Colleen is Executive Director and General Counsel of the Connecticut Freedom of Information Commission, an independent state agency that hears complaints of violations of the state's FOI and open meetings laws. She also testifies frequently before our legislature in Connecticut on bills affecting the public's right to know how their government is operating. Somewhat unique system in Connecticut, and one that I have used as a journalist and am certainly grateful for. So we will hear from all of them, but we want to hear from all of you as well. We have chat and Q&A opportunities, and I encourage you in the audience to use those at any time. And we'll also try to reserve about 10 minutes or so at the end for kind of a more open Q&A. All right, so let us get started. I'm going to start with you, Gail. from Sheridan, Wyoming, where it's, I believe, supposed to hit 80 degrees today and then snow on Sunday. So we'll take up meteorological challenges at a future panel. But for now, can you give us a sense of the situation with transparency in the Wyoming legislature? And, you know, as our title says, the written and unwritten rules that conspire to keep the public in the dark.
So my family, I'm fourth generation ag in Wyoming. We got the land patent on our current property the same year Wyoming became a state. So our roots run really deep, and nonetheless, anybody who comes to Wyoming, I don't care how long they've been here, if you take on being a person from Wyoming, then I don't care if you've only been here 4 months. So while my roots run deep, what's unique about Wyoming is because we are the smallest, and we like to quote, I don't know if it was Senator Al Simpson, but somebody who said, we are a small town with really, really long streets, because we do operate more like our cities and towns are more like neighborhoods within a single community. And that actually kind of sets the stage for a lot of why there's probably more visibility and transparency in the state, simply because you know so many people. And so it's difficult to keep things hidden, just like when you were a kid and your mom found out some crap you pulled, you know, down the block before you even got home. It's kind of like that in a small state. So I grew up with parents who are very involved in public processes. My mother was always a proponent of people getting involved. And we were raised with the idea that the government is simply the way a community manages itself. And so all the things that you need in order to be a well-managed community should apply. So I left the state after getting a degree from the University of Wyoming, went into the Navy, retired from there, went to work for GE, retired from there, and came back to Wyoming at the end of January 2016. And what happened for me there, so I stayed voting, got really good information from my mom on, who the choices were. So I voted every year. I always stayed voting and stayed aware of what was going on. So I came back, and the election that year was very disturbing to me because it was nasty. There was what I thought was a deliberate misrepresentation of sitting legislators' voting records. And when I went to find out more about it, I found out that it's very confusing for the regular citizen to understand voting records and what the process is and how to find out the information. So they end up relying on websites that cherry pick and say, these are the important ones, and these were what the legislators' voting records were. And that actually started up the Civics 307. And so now, instead of going on vacation, I spend my vacation time and money sitting in on the legislature. Our legislature runs for 20 days on the even years and 40 days on the odd years. And that's actually in our Constitution. We have 60 days of legislature over a 2-year period. And then we have quite a bit of interim. So we very much are a citizen legislature. Nobody can make a living as a legislature. And in fact, that's one of the barriers that we have, is to get people other than some specific professions and retired people involved so that we have a greater view. So again, because we are small, everybody knows the press and the press knows everybody. The biggest problem we have in terms of press freedom is simply because we're such a small market. We have an incredible turnover. So for example, we had a really, really good person from the Chicago Star Tribune who ended up going to North Carolina, and now he's back up in Massachusetts. So it's that turnover, but the legislators themselves are very accessible. I mean, you'll walk out, they'll take a break in a session, and somebody will have a mic there, and they'll basically talk to anybody. So as far as accessibility to the legislators, it's very, very open. And in terms of being able to watch, I was saying just before we started that I felt like we had a significant improvement in our visibility to what was going on. And a part of that came out of the pandemic. So as it is right now, every single session is now taped and put up on a YouTube channel. And so anybody in the state or in the country, the world, can actually both watch what's going on the floor, as well as come back later. And, you know, from a transparency standpoint, you can grab a clip and use that as you need. But it also has each of the committee meetings. And so if there was going to be an issue with transparency, it would actually be in the committee meetings where a lot of the work happens. And those now are being taped and being made available on YouTube. And they have a very good process. We've got, in my mind, excellent chairs of our committees who make sure we have a set process of allowing people to speak. So in those terms, the process is very good. When it comes to records, so what I do in Civics 307 is it's difficult for casual observers of the process to understand how it's working. So something gets introduced on the floor, it gets sent to a committee, and we get, if you happen to be down there, you get a printed out thing that says, this is what happened the day before. And what I found is that people don't understand that that's not everything. So, well, it is everything that happened, but what's missing is a chair can do a pocket veto. So just because it went into a committee doesn't mean it's actually going to be heard. So you can see a few days back that it went there, but you've lost sight of that and you don't realize that there is a bill that's sitting in committee that's not going anywhere. And so what I do is I provide a spreadsheet that shows where every piece of legislation is in each step of the process and help people to understand that there are a minimum of 11 chances for a piece of legislation to die. It's really set up for it to die, not to make it through. So the final thing on the records and what makes it challenging for me is, again, because the voting records have been weaponized in some case. I try to go through, and it's very time consuming, to pull up the last recorded vote by each legislature on each piece of legislation. Because the other piece that's hard for folks to understand is that you might vote to introduce something and really dislike half of it, but you think that it can be solved, you know, that it can be resuscitated. And so the version that is put into law may be vastly different than what your first vote was. And so what I would like to see is having it be easier to obtain what those final voting is. And I asked about it and it was like, no, that was they voted on that and said no. The other thing they voted on and said no, and by they, I mean the legislators, is that they are not going to display what the votes are. And so sometimes, again—
You mean the who voted, the actual tally of votes?
At the time. So afterwards, if it is a roll call vote, you can see it. What you cannot see is when it's not a roll call vote, you only get the ayes and nays, and you can't see who's standing up or who's saying yes, unless somebody calls for a roll call vote. And so it would be really great if we could see that in real time instead of after the fact. But really, that's about the only complaint I currently have. And we have 93 legislators now, 62 in the House and 31 in the Senate. So it is a very small club. I think some legislatures are really large. So our smallness really helps, and they don't really do anything in back rooms. They have some caucuses in the Democratic caucus, which is about 15% of the legislature. Those are open. The Republican caucuses are closed. But really, that's about it.
All right. So it's interesting because it seems like I want to move on and make sure we get to Rob next as well. Yeah. But it seemed like there were issues during the pandemic where it was a little harder to get access, and that was the case in many states. But maybe that has actually led to something better if now this idea of making things available virtually has, sort of taken a permanent hold there. So that may be good to hear. We'll hear some other good ideas as well later on. But I want to turn now to Rob Schofield in North Carolina. Rob, as I understand it, a decade or so ago, new legislative leaders came in promising transparency and reform. So how'd that work out?
Yeah, I've got a lot more complaints than Gail has. I'm Rob Schofield from North Carolina. I run a nonprofit newsroom called NC Policy Watch. We're actually part of a growing national nonprofit newsroom network called States Newsroom. We probably have outlets in many of your states. It actually was founded by a guy named Chris Fitzsimon, who was the founder of NC Policy Watch. It's based here in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. We're really proud to be a part of that. We are technically housed in a nonprofit advocacy organization called the North Carolina Justice Center, but we are really just housed there. We are a separate organization, and indeed, I think those ties are in the process of sort of severing here in the coming weeks and months, and we'll be more formally a part of States Newsroom. But, I've been in North Carolina for 30 years, and it's never really been a super transparent place throughout those decades. And I'm old enough to remember when, literally the pre-internet era in which we had to physically walk into the legislative building to get calendars and copies of bills. And there was a phone room, that you could actually make a phone call where you hung out with the lobbyists. Closed door meetings have always been an issue in our General Assembly, committee meetings, bills being written in secret. Obviously, online communication brought many advances there in terms of access to information. We now can get access to bills. We can get access to how people voted in committee and things like that, and on the floor. But my general take over the last decade is that things should be a lot better than they really have been. Many of the shortcomings that have been visible over the last decade, I think, and this is since the Republican Party assumed control of the General Assembly for the first time, they came in promising more transparency, more openness, and there were reasons to do that. There were many flaws when the Democrats were running things, but we really haven't experienced the renaissance that was promised. There is really, I would say, almost a hostile adversarial relationship between the legislative leadership and many parts of the news media. We still do not have publicly televised sessions or video recordings of our sessions. There is an audio recording of the House. There's no televised session, no even audio recording of the Senate. We have news media outlets here. We have a local WRAL television, which is a very public-spirited television station that fills that bill a lot of the time, but not always. So it's often there. It's literally impossible to get a recording of, much less a video recording of our hearings, of our floor sessions. There's also been, I'd say, over the last few years, a real demise of sort of legislative process here in North Carolina. We are, of course, a deeply purple, hotly contested state, and I'm sure that plays a large role in it. It's a 50-50 state. Republicans have been able to secure and maintain control of the General Assembly through aggressive gerrymandering, and they sort of bring that same attitude sometimes to their relationship with the media and with members of the public. We have very little notice on bills being taken up. There's a lack of process in developing and improving the budget, which is by far the most important bill that our General Assembly, produces every session. It tends to be a catch-all bill that's very thick with all kinds of what we call special provisions, basically law changes in, myriad areas, literally written behind closed doors and presented sort of as one big package. Indeed, in recent years, it's even been structured. The debate in the General Assembly has been structured so no amendments could even be offered. It's simply been presented as what we call a committee substitute. So the bill has to be voted yay or nay, up or down. We've also had, I'd say, a general closing off of the building, a lack of access. Security is often listed as an excuse in the modern era, and there's probably some merit to that, but it's just harder for the public to get into the legislative building here in North Carolina anymore. We meet in something called the legislative building. The old state capitol building was obsolete and replaced in the early 60s. The building access, just a few years ago, they cut off tabling, which was a series of events where citizens would just have, the disabled citizens day at the General Assembly, and they would have tables on the first floor of the legislative building where people could come and learn and interact. Those have all been canceled in recent years. We've also had the phenomenon, of course, of the media sort of evaporating before our eyes. Our press room, which used to be very prominent on the very first floor of the legislative building, was moved to the basement by the current leadership of the General Assembly, even as the number of media outlets covering the General Assembly has just been, decimated. Groups like ours have attempted to fill some of that void, but we've actually been blocked from really participating as full members of the Capitol Press Corps. This is something that is a result both of actions taken by the legislative leadership and the staff that run the legislative building, as well as the press corps that remains. They have been, interestingly, uninterested in having nonprofit groups like ours that may have some affiliation with an advocacy organization. Even though we are award-winning members of the North Carolina Press Association, they've been less than welcoming to us. We had trouble getting press credentials. That's been a big problem. We had an incident a couple of years back where my colleague was arrested because he couldn't, he wasn't able to sit in the press section of the legislative on the floor of the House. And when the speaker ordered the chamber, the gallery to be cleared because there were protests going on, he told the sergeant at arms, "Look, I'm media, I'm staying." No, he was arrested too. So that's been a challenge. Access to records, a long-standing chronic problem here, delays, exorbitant charges, making documents unavailable unless they're in very unuser-friendly formats. It's been, again, a particular problem under GOP leadership at the General Assembly. We've got a very hostile Legislative Services Committee chair who's actually himself a former Republican mayor of the city of Raleigh. He's the nephew of the infamous Jesse Helms, and he sort of, I think, still vents his spleen towards progressive critics by denying them access to records. But it's also a problem at varying levels of state agencies under Democratic control as well. We have an open government coalition here in North Carolina, but it's a very small organization, one staffer, a very limited open government infrastructure. So lots of things I'd like to see changed here. And I've got some ideas. Perhaps we can share those later. I don't want to step on Colleen's time. I hope that gives you at least sort of a flavor of what we're dealing with here in North Carolina.
That does. I'm curious about one thing. So when the Democrats were in charge a dozen years ago, the Republicans said we need greater transparency. We promised reforms. Not a gigantic surprise what happened when the other party took power.
Sure.
Are the Democrats now saying we need transparency, we need reforms, we need to or are they okay with the system?
No, I think they do say that. And I do think I would expect a measure of improvement. For instance, in the governor's office, which is controlled by a Democrat, we don't have those problems. We have no trouble getting press credentials. We can go to press conferences, ask questions. We're treated like normal media. We don't get that right now from the Republican leadership at the General Assembly. I think it would be better. I don't have any illusions that it would be perfect, but I do think it's much like gerrymandering, quite frankly. The Democrats were guilty of gerrymandering when they were in power. The Republicans took control and perfected it here in North Carolina, took it to the next level. And I think the Democrats realize the error of their ways now, that they should have supported nonpartisan redistricting in our state. And I think maybe perhaps in sort of the same way, they would probably be more open to a more, if they were ever able to regain control of the General Assembly. But that seems like a very far off idea at this point.
Right. All right. So, Colleen, Hello.
Hello.
Connecticut is regarded as something of a leader in FOI and transparency, at least comparatively speaking. I know a lot of journalists around the country who are envious of our laws. So may we assume that Connecticut's legislature is a model of transparency with nary a complaint to be found?
No, I would not assume that, Matt. But in terms of our law, it does, of course, cover the legislature, which, as you've said, that is not the case in every state. It covers every legislative office of the state. And also we've ruled that individual legislators, we've come up with this neat little dichotomy that individual legislators themselves are also subject to the law. They are not subject to the law when they're just dealing with their constituent issues, but when they're dealing with anything regarding lawmaking, they're subject to the FOI law. So that's all good stuff. And I do have some good things to say about the legislature. Unlike in North Carolina, our sessions are broadcast on the Connecticut network, both for the House and the Senate. The Connecticut network is sort of our version of C-SPAN, if you will. And many of the committee meetings are covered in the same way, and you can access both audio and video. So that's been really great. And I know citizens really like having that access. But beyond that, I have a number of issues with the legislature and the way it operates right now. And I've written down a bunch of them, but I'm just going to talk about a few of them. Probably the first thing that really gets in my craw is access to amendments. If a committee is voting on a bill and they do their substitute language and everybody sitting up there has their amendment and they're nudging each other and talking about it, well, heaven forbid you should go up and ask, could I see a copy of the amendment that you're going to change the public version of that bill? You'll often get kind of pushed away. Each committee has a different rule about when you might get access to the amendment. Maybe you don't get it till it shows up online, which thankfully these things do go up online. But there's no uniformity to that. And that, to me, doesn't play well for democracy in general. And I would also say another big problem and the dirty word in the realm of legislation is the rats that come out at the end of the session. Rob mentioned the budget bills and then the implementer bills, which are implementing the budget and often come out in a special session if they ran out of time, which that's another problem, running out of time. Which, unlike in Gail's state, we have sessions that run from either January to June or February to May, and yet we still run out of time. So we run out of time and don't get that budget until maybe 11:30 on the night that the session is about to end, and it's hundreds and hundreds of pages long. And it could alter the very commission for which I work for, and I might have no idea that that's in there. So the typical rat might include something that did not make it out of committee even, or didn't get its vote on the floor, maybe didn't even get a public hearing. And then lo and behold, it becomes legislation because it didn't see the light of day. Only the people in the real know knew that was going in there. And of course, in the pandemic world, we have some new issues, with all of the benefits. I do think that some benefits came out of that, providing options for citizens to testify remotely. But now we're trying to figure out, well, now what do we do in the sort of, hopefully, the post-pandemic world? I do believe that remote processes make the legislature more remote. You have lack of access to legislators. So for all of its benefits, I think the processes kind of contribute to opacity. It's just harder to get a hold of people, and the legislators know that. And many don't like it. Many express that they don't like it, but it has continued in that way. In addition, just checked this morning, our state capitol building and our legislative office building, the headline on the website says we are open to the public during regular hours, but only on the first floor. And so, again, you can't go to the legislators' offices. When they're in session, you can go to the second floor, so you can see the House in operation, but not the Senate. And I'm really hoping that this current session that they change that, because I think we just have to move out of that. I'm not sure what it is across the country, but I'm told that most state buildings like that are now more open than ours is. We have a lot of other issues. One other thing, just figuring out the legislative process itself. It's a real insider's game. Both, understanding the written rules, but then the unwritten ones are the really critical ones. And for an average citizen, if you don't know the lay of the land there, it's going to be tricky for you to get around. One example I would give of that is that it's a nice thing in our state, you can see online the go list. And I understand that in many states there isn't such a thing. So people complain that they have no idea what bills might be coming up before the legislature. We do have a go list, but you really don't want to rely on the go list. What you really need to get is the hot list, and only the insiders have the hot list. And beyond the hot list, there's like the super hot list. So somebody else has. I haven't figured out who has that yet. So that's just my short list of some of the issues that I think we see in Connecticut that I imagine are seen elsewhere, despite the fact that we do have a relatively open statute and environment.
All right. So can you give us a sense? You talked about it's something of an insider's game in there, and I sometimes and concerned when I'm sort of a dyed-in-the-wool transparency advocate, and sometimes think, well, is this inside baseball? As a journalist, when I was hunting for information, was this my personal crusade, or did it really matter? So issues with opacity in the legislature, barriers to access. Can you give us a sense of does this really matter? It certainly matters to policy wonks and to journalists. What's in it for the average citizen to have greater access to what's going on in the halls of the legislature?
You want me to proceed?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. I've thought that myself, Matt, many times. I'm the big nerd on this and many other topics, but I think it truly is important to democracy, even if people don't realize it. I think particularly in the climate that we live in right now, the political climate and just social climate, even that has, I think, come out of the political climate, that the more closed off our legislators are, the more that creates distrust, whether it's known or not. I think it just fosters that distrust, and especially when there's a good segment of our country that they don't really like their legislators. They don't believe that their heart is in the right place. Distrust is probably a light word for how people feel toward their legislators. So, and when they know that those legislators make decisions about their taxes and their conduct, when they do that in secret in any way, I think it gives people some seeds to grow more distrust.
Rob, I see you're unmuted. You have thoughts on those lines?
Well, I mean, there's no doubt that, gosh, the reporting, we've had so many stories that our reporters have investigated and reported on in recent years that have made enormous difference to public policy in North Carolina, that have resulted in lawmakers being sent to federal prison, that have, I don't think there's any doubt that having more access to public records can make an enormous difference. I mean, sometimes it is an insider's game, but the spill out into real world policy, I think, is undeniable. And frankly, I think there are a lot of stories that we have been we would probably be doing a much better job of reporting here in North Carolina if we had a little better access. And there are changes that would be made in our state if our readers and if the general public were better aware of things that are going on. So I haven't become completely cynical yet that this isn't just an insider's debate. I really do think it makes a difference and would make a difference to the extent we can continue to work in this direction and maybe get a Colleen in our state.
Yeah. Gail, what do you think?
Well, first of all, thank you, Colleen, for making me feel ever so much better about Wyoming, because we don't have a lot of those problems. So one thing, again, that's unique about Wyoming, I think, is that we have a constitutional requirement to have a balanced budget. So while oftentimes it's at the end of the session that the budget is passed, it's required to be balanced. And our current governor said he will not accept legislation by footnote. So when he came in, he started vetoing every piece of the budget that was legislating by footnote. And I think that's really critical for transparency, because people don't notice those footnotes. So that's one way that really made it, helped clear things up. We also have 2 weeks of open meetings in Appropriations Committee before the session starts that goes and scrubs through all the way through the budget bill. We also have a requirement that, except for the budget bill, all of our bills are single topic only. That then turns around and helps with the transparency, because it's actually unconstitutional to have the title of the bill be of a different topic than the body of the bill. So that's a real boon to those who want to follow it. So it's hard to get down to Cheyenne, so being in person is difficult. But again, very little is happening behind the scenes. And as I said, you're making me feel better and better about Wyoming. So thank you.
Well, that's really interesting. The single issue, again, unless people have figured out a clever way to have very vague titles or something, and lots of, as we call them in Connecticut, rats within there. But that gets me thinking about possible changes. A lot of worries these days about creeping authoritarianism, but I want to just briefly ponder the good side of dictatorship and imagine that each of you has been, appointed in charge of all legislative rules and practices. In just a minute or two, make sure we have time for questions. What changes would you decree? Rob, you want to start with that? What you've touched on some stuff you'd like to see.
I mean, we would clearly televise all of our committee meetings, all of our legislative sessions, both the House and the Senate. They would be recorded, the video with coherent audio accessible to the public at all times. We would do away with these archaic rules that are limiting our press corps in the General Assembly and limiting access there, that I think are a vestige of a bygone era. I would think it would be wonderful if we could have an independent body to which we could apply for an independent arbiter that could decide whether or not a records request was appropriate or whether it was actually covered by public records law. As it is, it's sort of a self-enforcing situation right now. We often face month-long delays and constant nagging, and then exorbitant bills and lots of debate back and forth as to whether records are going to be provided. I think those are three that leap off the top of my tongue right now.
Yeah. All right. Gail, you got 60 seconds.
The one thing that I would really like to see is that hot list, I think you called it, which is the order in which the bills are going to be considered. That's put up on a whiteboard that's scribbled through and lined through and changed around. It would be great to have that as visible as some of the other things that we do. But other than that, I'm pretty happy.
Right. Colleen?
Okay, so I would get a law that says that we are going to only have single topic only bills. And in addition to that, I would pass a law that says that a bill can't pass unless it's had a public hearing of some kind. And if that's too much, if I have to yield to the populace, then I would at least say that any bill regarding freedom of information, transparency, before that were to pass, that needs a public hearing.
All right. I think I testified on something like that not too long ago. So I certainly agree with that. Hey, thanks everyone. I'd like to now open it up for the full floor. We had some thoughts in the chat as well, and someone mentioned, and I hope people can unmute. But someone talked about quadratic voting, using secret ballot quadratic voting, which is something I had not heard of. So if Jeff Roberts is with us and is able to unmute, perhaps he could explain that further. And if he's
Can you guys hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay.
Yep, thank you.
I was unmuted by the host. Yeah, this just came out last week. So in Colorado, we had a Colorado Supreme Court ruling in 1983 that our legislative caucuses are open. They're subject to the open meetings law. And what came out last week, some great reporting by a public radio station here, is that the Democratic caucus, which controls the legislature, has been using this secret ballot quadratic voting system, which is what it's called, to prioritize bills with fiscal notes. And they're doing this in session. And we wrote a letter, which I put in the chat, about why the many ways we think this violates our open meetings law. And it's something they've started using about 3 years ago. And it may be happening in your state, you just don't know about it. So because it was something that just got exposed. So I know every state is different with legislative caucus meetings and whether they're open or not. But that's why we wrote this letter.
What does quadratic mean in this case? I'm confused.
Well,
I understand what a secret ballot is.
It's the technical term for what they're doing, but they essentially have legislators prioritize bills, like which ones they want the most, and
which is what caucuses generally do. Yeah. Yeah,
but it's a computerized way of doing that.
I see.
Interesting. I guess I'm thinking about, and I don't know all the ins and outs of it, but the fact that they're doing this, they're also denying the results of this in public records requests. So you can't get that either. And we think that's a violation as well. So it may be something to check on in your state if it's being used here.
Yeah, I think maybe the idea is just to telegraph that it makes things as easy for the public to understand as the quadratic equation was when we were in high school. So
right.
That could be all right. And again, I unfortunately can only see the panelists, but I'm hoping organizers can see the full group. And if there's a way to sort of raise your hand if folks have a question or a comment. We got, wow, the time goes fast, about 8 minutes left. And would like to open this up to all of you folks. If anyone has a comment or a question and wants to expand on something that they had in the chat.
I want to just say that I think there is clearly room at some point for legislators to have private conversations. I don't think there's anybody who believes that there can't be some level of confidentiality in conversations between legislators. The question of whether caucuses, which in North Carolina are completely closed, should be open is, I think, a very valid one. At some point, I think we all would concede that lawmakers have a right to have confidential conversations with their colleagues. It's just a question of when that, where is the line between what ought to be public and what is legitimately something that could be private.
Yeah, that is a challenge, right? Because as a transparency advocate, it's easy to have kind of a knee-jerk thing of like, hey, if you were discussing legislation, you work for us, right? We're busy doing other things, so we are paying you to make laws and the like, but you still work for us. And if you had a cleaning service, they can't hide the mop, but in sort of an efficient system, most people, I imagine, would concede there needs to be some opportunity to sort of talk privately and off the cuff and without concerns about politics. But yeah, the question is certainly, where is the line with that?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I sort of knocked Hawaii at the beginning for what it seemed like at least one really odd law. Someone talked about Hawaii Hawaii is a committee sponsored by the House looking closely at various problems with the legislative rules and practices. And unfortunately, maybe if I widen this, there we go. Brian Black, if you're with us. In fact, I see you there and you're unmuted. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So we had a couple legislators recently plead guilty to accepting bribes. And as a result of that, our House set up a committee that is currently looking at a bunch of stuff. It's looking at improvements to the public records law. It's looking at, ethics, campaign finance, but also looking at legislative practices and procedures and how to make them better in terms of just improving standards of conduct. And a lot of the stuff that is being talked about here is coming up in those contexts about pocket vetoes by committee chairs and things like that. So I don't know if it's replicable in other jurisdictions, but it has been interesting to see legislators come to public meetings and explain what can work and what can't, and how they sort of do their business. So
interesting. Yeah, you said a couple of legislators were involved in bribery. In Connecticut, we would say only a couple, to sort of specify that not bad. Actually, it's our legislators. It's more our mayors and governors that get in trouble here. But certainly, I mean, I feel like I've heard kind of a common theme of the power of committee chairs in this to sort of direct what anyone has an opportunity to see, and to the extent that what they're doing in Hawaii might kind of open that up. And certainly issues with secret legislation. The single topic thing I think is fantastic. I would love to see that expand kind of everywhere. If anyone else has a question or a comment, kind of give a hand raise shortly, because I want to give each of our panelists kind of 60 seconds for any final thoughts. So I will wait about 10 seconds, or how long it takes me to finish this sentence, and see if anything comes up. I'm seeing, if folks have not seen, I will say this, the chat, there's a lot of interesting stuff in here. I see that Deborah Fisher just added something from Tennessee and her face has popped up. Deborah, did you want to expand on that? And I'm also curious, you say going back a decade or so. So this was not a pandemic issue. This is some forward thinking going way back.
Oh yeah, we've had video of committee and subcommittee meetings for years. I don't know exactly how long, but you can go online even now and get video from at least a decade or more ago. I wish I could remember the exact date, but I think it's a great system, and to be able to have access to video on a bill from 10 years ago.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think so. I can see the value in that. And in terms of being able to view them live, I'm now really torn, given Colleen's idea that, being remote makes the connection between citizen and legislature more remote, and that is challenging. It is certainly a trade-off there. As much as during the pandemic, it's certainly been a valuable opportunity
substitute
there. Yeah. All right, we have just a couple of minutes left, so I want to very much thank our panelists and thank our audience here, but also give each of them maybe a quick 60 seconds if they have any final thoughts? So Gail, why don't you take it away? We started with you. We'll start ending with you.
Okay, great. Well, I will point out, because we brought up caucuses, and the Republican caucus is closed, but we're a supermajority of Republicans, and the inevitable happens if you have groups of folks who see anybody who disagrees with them as the enemy. Then if you don't have the enemy of the other party, you find enemies within your own party. So there is a pretty big division that is becoming more and more clear within the Republicans. And therefore, I feel pretty confident that anything that went on in caucus would somebody would spill the tea, because there are folks who have a vested interest in that. So I'm confident that there's not, like sneaky things going behind, simply because they're all looking out for what the other side is doing. So
interesting. Colleen, any final thoughts for us? Oh,
muted.
Sorry about that. I'm just picking up on that theme a little bit. Something that I've come to believe in watching the legislature for so long and seeing the different political makeup of the legislature over time. Something I believe is that it's definitely better not to have supermajorities of either party in the legislature, because I think it yields less transparency, because there's less opposition. But your point about finding enemies within the own party is also very interesting. And just last, I'm considering making a trip to Wyoming after this session.
Yeah.
It's a terrific museum in Cody, I can tell you, that we were at years ago. All right, Rob, I'm going to give you the final word. Well,
I'm a lot more skeptical and less optimistic about things. I think that we are in a very divided political time in which it's really, we're about to have a supermajority again, probably, of Republican control in the North Carolina General Assembly, and I don't have much hope for what that will mean for transparency. I really think that establishing laws and rules and funding groups to oversee this and to provide some sort of independent arbitration or decision-making on access would be a tremendous advance here. And I think I'm anxious to learn more about how we could perhaps at least float that idea in our state.
All right, sounds good. Folks, we are at time. This flew by, as I knew it would. I learned some fascinating stuff I was not aware, and I've got a whole lot for me to think about, and I hope all of you have as well. This, I believe, is the last sort of real panel of the conference, but there is the cocktails and balloon session starting in 1 hour and 4 minutes. I didn't want to give a time because I know we got people in multiple time zones, but 1 hour and 4 minutes that begins, and I hope that is on all of your schedules as well. But with that, we have completed our 55 minutes. So thanks, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day. Enjoy the rest of the conference.